Jami-Lee Ross.
The question be now put.
Call Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the definition of the Bright Line rule, or the Bright Line test, is described as being objective, composed of objective factors, which leaves little or no room for varying interpretation. And the purpose is to produce predictable and consistent results in its application. And I think that you could describe this piece of legislation as being the very opposite of that test. So it's not a bright line, it's a very muddy, clouded line that is being produced by this government as its way of doing something about the rampant speculation in the Auckland housing market and the impact that that's having on our country and our country's economy, and the ability for New Zealanders to afford to buy a home, to afford to rent a home, and to be able to get ahead in this life. And what this government is doing with this legislation is just turned it into a political stunt, an absolute political stunt, which will require this House within the next couple of years, no doubt, to be looking at this again, because it's so token and so inadequate. Mr. Speaker, with particular regard to Part 1 of this legislation, with regard to the test at Clause 15, the test to residential land only, to Clauses 6 and 15, which excludes the sale of a person's main home from the test, Clauses 4 and 11, which exclude inherited property from the test, Clause 10, which excludes the transfer of property as a result of a relationship breakdown, and so on and so on. Mr. Chair, the point being that the test of a bright line is for there to be consistency and for there to be none or very, very little room for inconsistency in that objective test. Unfortunately, and despite the fact that there was a very truncated period for the Select Committee for the hearings and submissions on this bill, there were some very good submissions on this bill. Almost all of them questioned the objectivity, the objective test, and the consistency of the Bright Line test, and which is why we're going to see this legislation back in the House again. I want to refer briefly to an article by Terry Bocher, which no doubt other colleagues have mentioned, who is an Auckland-based tax specialist, who makes the very good point that good tax policy takes steps to remove inconsistency and improve coherence. Well, this legislation isn't doing that, Mr. Chair. My concern, particularly because I know that colleagues are speaking about other aspects of this bill, but is about the number of people that will get caught up in this legislation who shouldn't be caught up in this legislation, for where the grey and muddy, clouded areas will affect them, and the people who make their decision to sell the home that they have bought within that 2-year period because of personal circumstances, who have no idea that the impact that this legislation will have on them, and where this legislation has taken no regard for them and for the impact that it will have on them, whether they are people who have somebody die in their family, who have a divorce in their family, or for whatever reason, where they are the unintended consequences of this piece of legislation. That is one of the reasons this bill falls down.
I call Jami-Lee Ross.
I move that the question be now put.
I call